The year 1763, the year Britain defeated the French Empire and her native allies in the Western Hemisphere, should have been a moment of celebration and appreciation for Britain's American colonies. After all, after years of bloody fighting in the French and Indian War, Britain had emerged victorious, and French power in North America had been crushed, and British colonists no longer faced the same threat from France that had haunted them for generations. Yet, instead of bringing peace and harmony to the empire, Britain's victory would slowly plant the seeds of rebellion in the hearts of her colonists. You see, the war had left Great Britain deeply in debt. British leaders believed that the American colonies should help pay for the cost of their own defense, right? Because British soldiers, after all, had fought to protect colonial settlements. To many officials in London, this seemed only fair, right? To many colonists, however, the new policies felt like punishment. Let's think about it for just a second. You see, for decades, Americans had enjoyed a great deal of political freedom. Colonial assemblies comprised the local elected officials and made many of the local decisions. Taxes were generally approved by elected representatives, and British trade laws were often loosely enforced. And by the 1760s, the colonists had grown accustomed to governing themselves. After 1763, however, that all began to change. British officials began tightening enforcement of local trade laws and increased their oversight of colonial affairs. Many colonists felt that Britain no longer viewed them as loyal subjects, but as sources of revenue. The relationship between the colonies and the mother empire began to deteriorate. You see, in towns all across the colonies, merchants complained that stricter regulations made business more difficult. Farmers worried about declining economic opportunities to sell goods, and political leaders argued that Parliament was violating the rights of Englishmen. What angered many colonists the most, however, was that they no longer had duly elected representatives within their local government. If Parliament could tax them without consent, well, what other rights could it then take away? And the debate became increasingly heated. Now, some colonists still hoped for reconciliation and believed that misunderstandings could be resolved with peace and debate. Others, however, began to suspect that Britain intended to reduce the colonies to a state of political dependence. And by the early 1770s, Americans were discussing ideas that would have seemed unthinkable only a decade earlier. You see, they questioned whether Parliament had any authority over them at all. I mean, pamphlets, newspapers, and public meetings spread arguments about liberty, representation, and self-government. You see, the bonds connecting Britain and America were weakening, and the stage was being set for conflict. Britain's first major effort to raise revenue from the colonies came with the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, the act placed duties on sugar, molasses, coffee, wine, and other import goods, and although the tax itself was not overwhelming, to be fair, it was only about a 2% tax. However, the colonists were angered by strict enforcement measures aimed at stopping smuggling. Merchants who had long operated under relaxed regulations suddenly found customs officials examining cargo and enforcing duties more aggressively. Many colonists viewed the act as a dangerous precedent. In that same year, Parliament passed the Currency Act. The law prohibited colonies from issuing paper money, you see, instead relying upon a gold standard. This created significant hardship because many colonists lacked sufficient supplies of gold and silver currency. Paying debts became more difficult, and economic tensions, well, they grew. real explosion, however, came in 1765 with the Stamp Act. Now, unlike previous trade duties, the Stamp Act was a direct tax. Legal documents, newspapers, licenses, contracts, pamphlets, playing cards, and many other printed materials required official government stamps. Colonists saw the measure as an unprecedented assault on their rights, and protests erupted throughout the colonies. Crowds intimidated tax collectors and burned effigies of British officials. In Boston, angry demonstrators attacked the stamp collectors. Representatives from 9 colonies gathered at the Stamp Act Congress to coordinate opposition. Let's try putting ourselves in colonial shoes for just a minute. Imagine Nathaniel wants to take young Margaret out for a date. They go to a local tea house where he pays a 2% tax for the tea. Not to mention that the tea itself now costs more due to the importation tax. Then he goes to the bookstore to buy her that new book she's been wanting, right? But the book has an upcharge due to the tax on paper. Not only is Nathaniel paying way more for things, but his job only pays him in cash. And he now has to get his cash converted into gold in order to afford the taxes. This is when a powerful slogan emerged during this time of crisis: no taxation without representation. You see, the colonists argued that taxes could only be imposed by representatives chosen by the people being taxed. And since Americans elected no members of Parliament, well, they insisted Parliament lacked the authority to tax them. Faced with widespread resistance and pressure from British merchants put by colonial boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Colonists celebrated what seemed like a victory. Yet, simultaneously, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The conflict was far from over. In 1767 came the Townshend Acts. Now these laws imposed duties on imported goods, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And the revenue would help pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, rather than making them less dependent on colonial legislators. Once again, colonists responded with outrage. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Newspapers condemned Parliament's actions, and political leaders warned that accepting every small tax would establish a precedent for unlimited parliamentary authority. The colonies became increasingly united in resistance, although each colony had its own interests since crops and trade were regionally specific. Opposition to taxation provided a common cause. Tensions continued to build throughout the early 1770s. Then, British introduced a measure that would ignite one of the most famous protests in American history. The Tea Act of 1773 was intended to rescue the struggling British East India Trading Company. The act allowed for the company to sell tea directly to colonies at reduced prices, which ironically, the tea would have actually become cheaper. But colonists saw beyond the lower prices, and the act granted the East India Company a monopoly and threatened colonial merchants. More importantly, it retained the tax on tea established under the Townshend Acts, and to many Americans purchasing the tea would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. Resistance spread rapidly, and when tea ships sailed toward American ports in 1773, opposition greeted them almost everywhere. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, protesters successfully pressured tea consignees to resign. In some colonies, tea ships returned to Britain without unloading their cargo. Boston, however, proved to be a little bit different. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson was determined that the tea would be unloaded and the tax would be collected. Unlike officials elsewhere, though, he refused to back down. As tea ships arrived in Boston Harbor, massive public meetings took place. Thousands crowded into churches and town meeting halls. Patriot leaders urged resistance. Citizens debated what action should be taken. The issue involved far more than just tea, though. You see, colonialists feared monopolies. They worried about government interference in commerce. Most importantly, they believed that Britain was attempting to establish a dangerous precedent. If Parliament could tax tea, what else would it be taxing? As the deadline for unloading approached, tension reached a breaking point, and on December 16th of 1773, hundreds gathered at Old South Meeting House after receiving word from Governor Hutchinson still refused to allow the ships to leave. The meeting erupted with excitement and roars. That evening, a group of men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. With their faces hidden, they marched towards the harbor. The crowd watched as they boarded 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Working quickly and efficiently, they smashed open chest after chest of tea. Tea leaves poured into the Boston Harbor, and for 4 hours the destruction continued. When it was over, more than 300 chests of tea had been destroyed. The participants carefully avoided damaging other property. Their target was the tea itself, a symbol of parliamentary taxation. News of the Boston Tea Party, however, spread throughout the Atlantic world. Its supporters hailed it as a courageous act of resistance. British officials, however, viewed it as open rebellion, and the empire moved closer to a confrontation. The consequences of the Boston Tea Party were obvious. British leaders were furious. In response, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures known in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts government was placed under tight British control. The authority of royal officials increased. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, however, these actions actually united the colonies even more. You see, many Americans who had previously remained neutral now feared that Britain threatened the liberties of all colonies. Committees of correspondence, a secret group of writers who wrote each other in codes relaying political thoughts and actions, spread news and coordinated resistance. Colonial leaders called for a Continental Congress to organize a collective response, and in September of 1774, delegates from across the colonies assembled in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress adopted boycotts and petitions while preparing for the possibility of an armed resistance. Across New England, however, local militias increased their training. Weapons and supplies were gathered, and Minutemen prepared to respond quickly in emergencies of action. The conflict was no longer simply about taxes. You see, it became a struggle over power, rights, and self-government. Before the Tea Party, you see, violence had been erupted in Boston. You see, the city had been occupied by British troops since 1768. And their presence created constant competition for housing, supplies, financial and political disagreements, and mutual distrust produced frequent confrontations between soldiers and civilians alike. But on the evening of March 5th, 1770, events that began as mere child's play began to spiral out of control and into bloodshed. You see, the trouble began when a young apprentice of a local wig maker, a 13-year-old boy named Edward Garrett, insulted a British officer near the custom house. You see, the officer had recently purchased a wig from Garrett's store, and Garrett had thought that he had stiffed him a payment. Unbeknownst to Garrett, however, the army officer had actually paid for it earlier that day. But Private Hugh White, upon seeing the confrontation between Garrett and the officer, intervened and struck the boy with his musket butt, knocking him unconscious. A crowd quickly gathered, and Edward Garrett's fellow apprentice, a half-black, half-native local named Crispus Attucks, ran to the boy's rescue. Now, people shouted insults, church bells rang, drawing more citizens into the streets. Snowballs and other objects flew through the air, and anger towards the deliberate assault boiled. Now, as the situation was clearly worsening, Captain Thomas Preston arrived with additional soldiers, promising the crowd that Private White would be investigated and that peace would be ensured. The crowd pressed closer as screams of "Fire!" and "Criminal!" erupted in the air. Among those present was Crispus Attucks, who became one of the central figures of the evening. Protesters challenged the soldiers and dared them to fire. Then chaos erupted. You see, a projectile struck Private Hugh Montgomery, knocking him down. Furious, he rose and fired his musket into the crowd, hitting Mr. Attucks directly into the heart. Moments later, additional shots rang out, and when the smoke cleared, several colonists lay wounded or dying. Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, and James Caldwell were killed immediately, and others would die from their injuries later that night. Shock spread throughout Boston. The event quickly became known as the Boston Massacre. Now, it is important to note here that Captain Preston went to court for the events, and that Private White was reprimanded for the assault, while Private Montgomery was held responsible for manslaughter. Patriot leaders, however, seized upon the incident as evidence of British tyranny. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of the events, and Paul Revere's famous engraving portrayed British soldiers deliberately firing on innocent civilians into a crowd. The massacre became a powerful symbol for patriotism. Although only 5 colonists had died during the event convinced many Americans that standing armies threatened liberty. Annual commemorations kept memories of the tragedy alive and strengthened resistance to British rule. The relationship between Britain and its colonies continued to deteriorate, and war now seemed increasingly impossible. At the beginning of 1775, Massachusetts stood on the edge of a revolution. British General Thomas Gage served as both governor and military commander in the area, and he knew that colonial militias were storing weapons and ammunition throughout the countryside. Patriot leaders, meanwhile, expected British attempts to seize those supplies, and in April of 1775, Gage received orders to suppress the rebellion. On April 18th, he dispatched approximately 700 British regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Their mission was to march to Concord and destroy military stores reportedly hiding there. Patriot intelligence networks quickly learned of the expedition. That evening, Joseph Warren warned Paul Revere and William Dawes that British troops were moving. Revere and Dawes rode through the countryside, spreading the alarm. Lanterns shone from Old North Church. Riders raced from town to town. Bells rang. Drums sounded. Militiamen grabbed muskets and prepared to assemble. The colonial alarm system worked brilliantly, and by the time British troops reached the countryside, communities throughout the Massachusetts area were already mobilizing. Just before sunrise on April 19th, British forces entered Lexington. Then John Parker and about 80 militiamen stood waiting on Lexington Green. They did not intend to start a battle. Parker reportedly ordered his men not to fire unless fired upon. As British soldiers approached, confusion erupted. You see, someone fired a shot. To this day, historians do not know who even fired first, honestly. The British, however, charged forward. Musket fire erupted, and 8 Americans were killed and several more were wounded. The revolution had begun. The British continued toward Concord. There, hundreds of militia members gathered around the town. British troops searched for military supplies, but found far less than they expected because the colonists had already hidden most of the weapons. At the North Bridge, events escalated. Approximately 400 militia members confronted fewer than 100 British soldiers guarding the crossing. Patriot officers ordered their men to advance. As the Americans approached, nervous British soldiers began to fire. Several militiamen fell, and Major John Buttrick shouted, "Fire! For God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire!" The military responded with a deadly volley. British soldiers were killed and wounded. The outnumbered regulars retreated across the bridge, and for the first time ever, organized colonial forces had driven British troops from the battlefield. The British soon began their return march towards Boston. What followed was a day-long running battle, unlike anything either side had ever expected. You see, militiamen poured in from dozens of towns. They fired from behind trees, stone walls, houses, and fences. British troops faced attacks from every direction. Exhausted soldiers struggled to maintain formation. Casualties mounted steadily. Lexington, reinforcements under Earl Percy arrived just in time to save the retreating force from total disaster. Even with reinforcements, however, the British endured relentless attacks during the march back towards Boston, and by evening the battered British column finally reached safety. The cost, though, was staggering. You see, the British suffered hundreds of casualties. Colonial losses were significant as well, but the Patriots had achieved something far more important. You see, they had proven that they could stand against the British Army. The fighting at Lexington and Concord transformed a political dispute into open war, and years of arguments over taxes, representation, military occupation, and political rights had culminated in an armed conflict. The road that began after the French and Indian War had ended in revolution. The American Revolution is underway.